Gilbert. Sometimes, when I've written a piece of prose that I have been modest enough to consider absolutely free from fault, a dreadful thought comes over me that I may have been guilty of the immoral effeminacy of using trochaic and tribrachic movements, a crime for which a learned critic of the Augustan age censures with most just severity the brilliant, if somewhat paradoxical, Hegesias. I grow cold when I think of it, and wonder to myself of the admirable ethnical effort of the prose of the charming writer, who once in a spirit of reckless generosity towards the uncultivated portion of our community proclaimed the monstrous doctrine that conduct is three-fourths of life, will not some day be entirely annihilated by the discovery that the peons have been wrongly placed. Ah, now you are flippant. Who would not be flippant when he is gravely told that the Greeks had no art critics? I can understand it being said that the constructive genius of the Greeks lost itself in criticism, but not that the race to whom we owe the critical spirit did not criticize. You will not ask me to give you a survey of Greek art criticism, from Plato to Plotinus. The night is too lovely for that, and the moon, if she heard us, would pour more ashes on her face than there are already. But think merely of one perfect little work of aesthetic criticism, Aristotle's treatise on poetry. It is not perfect in form, for it is badly written, consisting perhaps of notes dotted down for an art lecture, or of isolated fragments destined for some larger work. But in temper and treatment, it is perfect absolutely. The ethical effect of art, its importance to culture, and its place in the formation of character, had been done once for all by Plato, but here we have art treated, not from the moral, but from the purely aesthetic point of view. Plato had, of course, dealt with many definitely artistic subjects, such as the importance of unity in a work of art, the necessity for tone and harmony, the aesthetic value of appearances, the relation of the visible arts to the external world, and the relation of fiction to fact. He first perhaps stirred in the soul of man the desire that we have not yet satisfied, the desire to know the connection between beauty and truth, and the place of beauty in the moral and intellectual order of the cosmos. The problems of idealism and realism, as he sets them forth, may seem to many to be somewhat barren of result in the metaphysical sphere of abstract being in which he places them. But transfer them to the sphere of art, and you will find that they are still vital and full of meaning. It may be that it is as critic of beauty that Plato is destined to live, and that by altering the name of the sphere of his speculation, we shall find a new philosophy. But Aristotle, like Goethe, deals with art primarily in its concrete manifestations, taking tragedy, for instance, and investigating the material it uses, which is language, its subject matter, which is life, the method by which it works, which is action, the conditions under which it reveals itself, which are those of theatric presentation, its logical structure, which is plot, and its final aesthetic appeal, which is to the sense of beauty realized through the passions of pity and awe. That purification and spiritualizing of the nature which he calls cleansing is, as Goethe saw, essentially aesthetic, and is not moral, as Lessing fancied. Concerning himself primarily with the impression that the work of art produces, Aristotle sets himself to analyze that impression, to investigate its source, to see how it is engendered. As a physiologist and psychologist, he knows that the health of a function resides in energy. To have a capacity for a passion and not to realize it is to make oneself incomplete and limited. The mimic spectacle of life that tragedy affords cleanses the bosom of much perilous stuff, and by presenting high and worthy objects for the exercise of the emotions, purifies and spiritualizes the man. Nay, not merely does it spiritualize him, but it initiates him also into noble feelings, of which he might else have known nothing. The word momentary pleasure, it's a Greek word, I don't know. The word blank having, as it has sometimes seemed to me, a definite allusion to the rite of initiation, if indeed that be not, as I am occasionally tempted to fancy, is true and only meaning here. This is, of course, a mere outline of the book, but you see what a perfect piece of aesthetic criticism it is. Who indeed but a Greek could have analyzed art so well? After reading it, one does not wonder any longer that Alexandria devoted itself so largely to art criticism, and that we find the artistic temperaments of the day investigating every question of style and manner, discussing the great academic schools of painting, for instance, such as the school of Sicyon, that sought to preserve the dignified traditions of the antique mode, or the realistic and impressionistic schools that aimed at reproducing actual life, or the elements of ideality in portraiture, or the artistic value of the epic form in an age so modern as theirs, or the proper subject matter for the artist. Indeed, I fear that the inartistic temperaments of the day busied themselves also in matters of literature and art, for the accusations of plagiarism were endless, and such accusations proceed either from the thin, colorless lips of impotence, or from the grotesque mouths of those who, possessing nothing of their own, fancy that they can gain a reputation for wealth by crying out that they have been robbed. And I assure you, my dear Ernest, that the Greeks chattered about painters quite as much as people do nowadays, and had their private views, and shilling exhibitions, and arts and craft guilds, and pre-Raphaelite movements, and movements towards realism, and lectured about art, and wrote essays on art, and produced their art historians, and their archaeologists, and all the rest of it. Why, even the theatrical managers of traveling companies brought their dramatic critics with them when they were on tour, and paid them very handsome salaries for writing laudatory notices. Whatever, in fact, is modern in our life, we owe to the Greeks. Whatever is an anachronism is due to medievalism. It is the Greeks who have given us this whole system of art criticism. And how fine their critical instinct was may be seen from the fact that the material they criticized with most care was, as I have already said, language. For the material that painter or sculptor uses is meager in comparison with that of words. Words have not merely music as sweet as that of viol and lute. Color is rich and vivid as any that makes lovely for us the canvas of the Venetian or the Spaniard, and plastic form no less sure and certain than that which reveals itself in marble or in bronze. But thought and passion and spirituality are theirs also, are theirs indeed alone. If the Greeks had criticized nothing but language, they would still have been the great art critics of the world. To know the principles of the highest art is to know the principles of all the arts. But I see that the moon is hiding behind a sulphur-colored cloud. Out of a tawny mane or drift, she gleams like a lion's eye. She is afraid that I will talk to you of Lucian and Longinus, of Quintilian and Dionysus, of Pliny and Fronto and Pausanias, of all those who in the antique world wrote or lectured upon art matters. She need not be afraid. I am tired of my expedition into the dim, dull abyss of facts. There is nothing left for me now but the divine, momentary pleasure of another cigarette. Cigarettes have at least the charm of leaving one unsatisfied. Try one of mine. These are rather good. I get them direct from Cairo. The only use of our attachés is that they supply their friends with excellent tobacco. And as the moon has hidden herself, let us talk a little longer. I am quite ready to admit that I was wrong in what I said about the Greeks. They were, as you have pointed out, a nation of art critics. I acknowledge it, and I feel a little sorry for them, for the creative faculty is higher than the critical. There is really no comparison between them. The antithesis between them is entirely arbitrary. Without the critical faculty, there is no artistic creation at all worthy of the name. You spoke a little while ago of that fine spirit of choice and delicate instinct of selection by which the artist realizes life for us and gives it to a momentary perfection. Well, in that spirit of choice, the subtle tact of omission is really the critical faculty in one of its most characteristic moods, and no one who does not possess this critical faculty can create anything at all in art. Arnold's definition of literature as a criticism of life was not very felicitous in form, but it showed how keenly he recognized the importance of the critical element in all creative work. I should have said that the great artists work unconsciously, that they were wiser than they knew, as I think Emerson remarks somewhere. It is really not so, Ernest. All fine imaginative work is self conscious and deliberate. No poet sings because he must sing, at least no great poet does. A great poet sings because he chooses to sing. It is so now, and has always been so. We are sometimes apt to think that the voices that sounded at the dawn of poetry were simpler, fresher, and more natural than ours, and that the world which the early poets looked at, and through which they walked, had a kind of poetical quality of its own, and almost without changing could pass into song. The slow lies thick now upon Olympus, and its steep scarped sides are bleak and barren, but once, we fancy, the white feet of the Muses brush the dew from the anemones in the morning, and at evening Apollo came to sing the shepherds in the vale, but in this we are merely lending to the other ages what we desire, or think we desire, for our own. Our historical sense is at fault. Every century that produces poetry so is so far an artificial century, and the work that seems to us to be the most natural and simple product of its time is always the result of the most self-consciousness, and self-consciousness and the critical spirit are one. I see what you mean, and there is much in it, but surely you would admit that the great poems of the early world, the primitive, anonymous collective poems, were the result of the imagination of races rather than the imagination of individuals. Not when they became poetry, not when they received a beautiful form, for there is no art where there is no style, and no style where there is no unity, and unity is of the individual. No doubt Homer had old ballads and stories to deal with, as Shakespeare had chronicles and plays and novels from which to work, but they were merely his rough material. He took them and shaped them into song. They became his because he made them lovely. They were built out of music, and so not built at all, and therefore built forever. The longer one studies life and literature, the more strongly one feels that behind everything that is wonderful stands the individual, and that it is not the moment that makes the man, but the man who creates the age. Indeed, I am inclined to think that each myth and legend that seems to us to spring out of the wonder or terror or fancy of tribe and nation was in its origin the invention of one single mind. A curiously limited number of the myths seems to me to point to this conclusion. But we must not go off into questioning questions of comparative mythology. We must keep to criticism. And what I want to point out is this. An age that has no criticism is either an age in which art is immobile, hieratic, and confined to the reproduction of formal types, or an age that possesses no art at all. There have been critical ages that have not been creative in the ordinary sense of the word, ages in which the spirit of man has sought to set in order the treasures of his treasure house, to separate the gold from the silver and the silver from the lead, to count over the jewels, and to give names to the pearls. But there has never been a creative age that has not been critical also, for it is the critical faculty that invents fresh forms. The tendency of creation is to repeat itself. It is to the critical instinct that we owe each new school that springs up, each new mold that art finds ready to its hand. There is really not a single form that art now uses that does not come to us from the critical spirit of Alexandria, where these forms were either stereotyped or invented or made perfect. I say Alexandria not merely because it was there that the Greek spirit became most self conscious, and indeed ultimately expired in skepticism and theology, but because it was to that city, and not to Athens, that Rome turned for her models, and it was through the survival, such as it was, of the Latin language that culture lived at all. When at the Renaissance Greek literature dawned upon Europe, the soil had been in some measure prepared for it, but to get rid of the details of history, which are always wearisome and usually inaccurate, let us say generally that the forms of art have been due to the Greek critical spirit. To it we owe the epic, the lyric, the entire drama in every one of its developments, including burlesque, the idyll, the romantic novel, the novel of adventure, the essay, the dialogue, the oration, the lecture, for which perhaps we should not forgive them, and the epigram, in all the wide meaning of that word. In fact, we owe it everything except the sonnet, to which, however, some curious parallels of that movement may be traced in the anthology, American Journalism, to which no parallel can be found anywhere, and the ballad in sham Scotch dialect, which one of our most industrious writers has recently proposed should be made the basis of a final and unanimous effort on the part of our second-rate poets to make themselves really romantic. Each new school, as it appears, cries out against criticism, but it is to the critical faculty in man that it owes its origin. The mere creative instinct does not innovate, but it reproduces.